John Carter had always believed in hard work. Since he was a young boy, he grew up watching his father till the soil under the burning sun and his mother carrying baskets of vegetables from the fields to the small market in town. The land was not just a piece of property for John, it was part of his identity, his heritage, and his hope for a better future. Unlike many children who dreamed of escaping the farm life, John dreamed of transforming it. He wanted to prove that farming was not just survival, but a path to success, dignity, and independence. As the years passed, John poured his energy into the family farm. He studied agriculture, learned new methods, and worked from dawn until long after the sun had disappeared. His hands were rough, his back often ached, but his spirit was unshaken. Slowly, what once was a small family plot grew into a thriving business. He invested in better seeds, modern equipment, and new technologies that allowed him to expand. His fields stretched wider, his crops grew healthier, and his reputation spread. People in the community began to look at him not just as a farmer, but as a businessman, a leader, and an example of determination. But John was not satisfied with only local success. He wanted to reach markets beyond his state, even beyond the country. His farm produced enough to supply restaurants, grocery chains, and international buyers, but transporting his goods was always a challenge. He spent long nights thinking about how to reduce delays, how to make deliveries faster, and how to ensure that his products reached customers in perfect condition. That was when the idea of owning a private jet first took root in his mind. For many people, the thought of a private jet was just a fantasy, something only celebrities and billionaires could imagine. But for John, it was not about luxury, it was about strategy. He saw it as an investment that would help him grow his empire. With a jet, he could travel to meetings quickly, negotiate deals face-to-face, and explore new opportunities without wasting time. It wasn't just about flying. It was about opening doors that were usually closed to people like him. The dream kept him awake at night, but instead of feeling impossible, it gave him energy. Every morning, he rose before the rooster crowed, determined to work harder than the day before. He saved money carefully, refusing to waste even a single dollar. He reinvested profits into the farm, doubled his production, and built relationships with buyers who trusted his reliability. Whenever doubt crept in, he reminded himself of the bigger picture. His dream was not just to feed people, but to prove that a black farmer could rise above every barrier and claim his place at the top. His family supported him, though sometimes they thought he was reaching too far. His mother would say, "John, why not be satisfied with what you already have? Isn't this enough?" But John would gently smile and reply, "Mama, our people have always been told to settle for less. I don't want enough, I want more. Not only for me, but for every child who will one day believe they can dream bigger." With each passing year, his vision came closer. The numbers in his bank account grew, the demand for his crops expanded, and investors began to notice his work. He became a respected figure in both farming and business circles, often invited to speak at conferences about agriculture and entrepreneurship. Yet, no matter how much success he earned, John stayed grounded. He still walked his fields every morning, still touched the soil with his hands, and still remembered the days when his family barely had enough to eat. Finally, after years of discipline, sacrifice, and relentless effort, John found himself standing at a place he had only imagined. As a boy, he had enough wealth, enough influence, and enough courage to begin the process of buying his dream a private jet. It was not about showing off, not about being flashy. For John, it was about realizing the dream he had built with sweat and determination. It was proof that no matter where you come from, no matter what obstacles stand in your way, faith and persistence can lift you higher than anyone expects. That day, as he looked over his financial statements and spoke with his advisors, he felt a rush of emotions. He thought about his father, who had once said that farmers were destined to struggle forever. He thought about the times people laughed at him for dreaming too big. He thought about the young boy inside him who had promised himself never to give up. And now, that boy's dream was no longer a dream, was becoming reality. The journey had not been easy, but it had been worth every challenge. John Carter, the son of a poor farmer, had built a legacy. And as he prepared to take the final step toward purchasing the jet, his heart filled with pride. He wasn't just buying a plane, he was buying freedom, opportunity, and proof that even the most unlikely dreamers could rewrite their stories. John Carter's journey was never smooth. And if anyone looked at his life only from the outside, they would never truly understand how much determination it had taken for him to rise. People often admired his success. The wide acres of farmland, the tractors that hummed through golden fields, and the large silos filled with grain ready for shipment. But behind all of this stood years of pain, rejection, and silent battles that only a man of extraordinary determination could endure. From the very beginning, John knew that he would have to work twice as hard to achieve half the recognition. Being a black farmer in a system that had rarely been fair meant doors were closed before he could even knock. Banks hesitated to give him loans, suppliers charged him higher rates, and markets often undervalued his produce. Many of his neighbors' farmers, from different backgrounds, were granted opportunities he could only dream of. Yet, instead of allowing bitterness to grow in his heart, John used it as fuel. Every no that was thrown at him became a reason to push harder, to prove them wrong. His mornings started earlier than most. Long before dawn painted the horizon, John was already awake. He walked across the damp fields, feeling the dew cling to his boots, listening to the whisper of the wind through the crops. These walks were not just part of his routine, they were his meditation, his way of reminding himself why he endured the struggles. Each plant in the soil symbolized resilience. Each crop standing tall against storms was proof that survival required patience and strength. But determination is not built only in quiet mornings, it is forged in storms, both real and metaphorical. John experienced droughts that destroyed nearly half his crops in a single season. He experienced floods that washed away weeks of labor. He faced equipment failures, debts that seemed impossible to pay off, and competitors who tried to push him out of business. There were nights he sat at the kitchen table, staring at bills he could not pay, wondering if his dream was too big, if perhaps life had set him up for failure. Yet, every time the thought of giving up crept into his mind, John reminded himself of one powerful truth: his ancestors had endured far worse. They had tilled land they did not own, labored without freedom, and survived against unimaginable odds. Compared to them, his struggles were battles he could fight and win. This thought alone gave him the courage to wake up the next day and keep going. What made John different was not that he had access to more resources, but that he made the most of whatever little he had. When he could not afford expensive machines, he fixed old ones with his own hands. When the banks denied him loans, he bartered with neighbors, offering them part of his harvest in exchange for tools or services. When markets turned him away, he found smaller buyers, slowly building trust until word of his reliability spread. He built his empire brick by brick, season by season, with nothing but determination as his foundation. Many people in his community began to notice this unshakable will. They saw how, even when storms destroyed half his crops, he never lost hope. Instead, he replanted, sometimes working day and night to make up for the loss. His story began to inspire others who faced their own struggles, showing them that persistence could indeed turn the impossible into reality. But John's determination was not only about surviving. He didn't want to just be another farmer who made ends meet. He wanted to set a new standard, to show that farming could be a business, a legacy, and a symbol of pride. He taught himself about global markets, studied agricultural science, and attended seminars where he was often the only black man in the room. Sometimes he faced stares, whispers, and even direct prejudice in those spaces, but he never let it break him. Instead, he held his head higher, determined to prove through knowledge and skill that he deserved to be there. At home, his determination shone even brighter. His family depended on him, and he wanted them to see that his efforts were not just about making money, but about creating a future. He often told his children, "Success is not handed to you, you must take it, even when the world tries to push it away from you." These words were not empty. They were lessons carved out of his own experiences, lessons he lived every single day. As his farm grew, so did the weight on his shoulders. Success did not make life easier, brought new challenges, new critics, and new responsibilities. Yet John's determination only grew stronger. He refused to allow setbacks to control him. If a supplier turned him down, he found another. If a machine broke, he repaired it himself. If the weather ruined his crops, he replanted without complaint. His philosophy was simple. Obstacles were not walls, they were tests. And each test was an opportunity to prove his strength. The deeper truth behind John's determination was that it wasn't fueled by pride alone, was fueled by love. Love for the land, love for his family. Love for the idea that one man's hard work could break chains that had bound generations before him. His determination was never selfish. It was about creating a path so wide that others could walk behind him without facing the same struggles. By the time John began to seriously consider buying a private jet, people around him were no longer surprised by his ambition. They had seen what his determination could achieve, and though some doubted him, many believed that if anyone could do it, John Carter could. What they did not know, however, was that his determination would soon be tested in ways that were not about farming, money, or business. It would be tested against prejudice, humiliation, and racism so sharp that it threatened to cut deep into the very core of his dignity. But if there was one thing life had already proven about John Carter, debt, was that he was not a man who broke easily. Determination had been the soil in which he grew, and no storm, no matter how cruel, could uproot him completely. His story was only just beginning, and his spirit of determination would soon face its greatest challenge yet. When John Carter finally reached the point where his dream of owning a private jet was within reach, it felt almost unreal. For years, he had whispered the idea to himself, nurturing it like a secret seed planted deep in his heart. Now, that seed had grown tall, watered by sacrifice, persistence, and countless nights of planning. The jet was not just a purchase, it was the embodiment of his ambition, proof of how far he had come, and a tool to take him even further. To John, a jet was never about showing off or chasing luxury. He had no interest in champagne on flights or posting pictures to impress the world. His vision was far bigger than that. The jet meant time saved from long road trips, time saved from delayed flights, time that could be invested back into his business, his family, and his community. He imagined flying to meetings across states in hours instead of days. He saw himself shaking hands with partners face-to-face rather than through screens, sealing deals that could multiply his farm's reach. He dreamed of exploring new markets, exporting his produce across borders, and lifting his farming empire into a new league altogether. Yet, deciding to buy a jet was not an overnight thought. John had studied the idea for years. He had attended aviation expos quietly, blending into crowds of wealthy businessmen and corporate CEOs, who never once suspected that a farmer in worn-out boots could be thinking about private aircraft. He read aviation magazines late at night, after long days in the fields, highlighting pages and jotting down notes. He spoke with financial advisors, ran numbers again and again, and carefully calculated the risks. To most people, buying a jet would seem outrageous, but to John, it was a carefully measured step forward. Still, even with all his planning, the thought of walking into an actual jet dealership filled him with nervous excitement. He had purchased tractors, combines, and heavy farming machinery before, but this was different. A tractor cost thousands. A jet cost millions. It was a new world, one he had never entered before, but John had never been afraid of new worlds. His whole life had been about entering spaces where people said he didn't belong. And proving them wrong, he prepared himself carefully for the day he would meet with the aircraft dealers. He ironed his best suit, polished his shoes until they gleamed, and carried himself with the calm confidence of a man who knew his worth. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He was simply showing respect for himself and the dream he was about to touch. As he looked at his reflection in the mirror, he thought of his father. He remembered the rough hands that had planted seeds in rocky soil, hands that never touched luxury but always held pride. John smiled softly and whispered, "This is for you, Papa, for all the times you dreamed but never had the chance." The dealership itself was unlike anything John had ever seen. Gleaming hangars lined with polished jets stood like giants waiting to take flight. The air smelled of metal and jet fuel, and the floors were so spotless they reflected the aircrafts. Like mirrors, for a moment, John simply stood still, taking it all in. This was the world he had imagined so many times, and now he was standing in the middle of it. Inside the showroom, the atmosphere was filled with quiet sophistication. Sales executives in sharp suits moved with practiced grace, greeting potential. Clients with smiles that seemed rehearsed but professional. Screens displayed sleek videos of aircraft soaring above clouds, while brochures rested neatly on glass tables. John's eyes scanned the space, landing on a jet that instantly caught his attention. Its streamlined body glistened under the lights, and its wings stretched with power and elegance. For a brief moment, John's heart raced. This wasn't just a machine, it was the key to the future he had envisioned. He walked closer, letting his hand hover near the polished exterior, almost afraid to touch it, as though it were too fragile or too sacred. He imagined himself inside, seated at the controls, or perhaps reviewing documents while flying to a meeting hundreds of miles away. He imagined the freedom, the efficiency, the statement it made not to others, but to himself. This was not about proving anyone wrong. This was about proving himself right. John took a deep breath and reminded himself why he was there. He had earned this moment. Every acre of land he had cultivated, every sleepless night, every insult he had swallowed, and every sacrifice he had made had brought him here. The jet wasn't just a purchase, it was his victory, his declaration that no dream was too big. Yet, beneath his excitement, John also felt a quiet tension. He knew that stepping into this space as a black farmer, as someone from a background rarely seen in luxury aviation, might raise questions, doubts, and even prejudice. He had experienced such reactions in banks, in boardrooms, and even in local markets. Still, he promised himself that no look, no question, no barrier would shake his resolve today. He had come too far to turn back as he walked toward the sales office. John straightened his shoulders and allowed his confidence to shine. He was not there to beg or prove his worth. He was there as a client, ready to do business. Whatever storm awaited him, he was prepared to face it head on. This purchase was not just about owning a jet. It was about rewriting a story. It was about a man who began with nothing but determination and turned it into everything. It was about a farmer who refused to stay confined to the fields, who dared to dream of skies, and who believed that the sky itself was not the limit, but only the beginning. John Carter was ready. Ready to sign the papers, ready to expand his empire, and ready to embrace the dream he had carried for so long. What he did not know, however, was that the moment he stepped into that sales office, the world would remind him just how cruel prejudice could be. He would soon discover that even in the world of luxury jets, where money should speak louder than anything else, the color of his skin could still trigger humiliation and disbelief. But in that moment, before the storm began, John's heart was light, his vision was clear, and his spirit was unbreakable. He had come for the ambitious purchase, and nothing, not even racism's harshest face, could erase the years of determination that had brought him to the threshold of his dream. When John Carter walked through the wide glass doors of the aircraft sales office, his heart carried a mix of excitement and calm resolve. He had rehearsed this day in his mind countless times, imagining how he would sit across from professionals, discuss options, and begin the process of owning the jet that would change the future of his business. He had envisioned polite handshakes, confident conversations, and respectful treatment, the kind any serious buyer would expect, but reality met him differently. The receptionist at the front desk looked up as he approached, her expression neutral at first, but then her eyes flickered with something else, something sharp and dismissive. It was subtle, the kind of look John had seen many times in his life, the kind that said, "Are you sure you're supposed to be here?" He smiled politely and introduced himself, explaining that he had scheduled an appointment with one of the sales executives. Her response was professional, yet her tone carried a hint of surprise, as though she couldn't quite connect the man standing in front of her in a simple but well-pressed suit with the idea of someone shopping for a private jet. As she made the call to the sales team, John stood quietly, his posture confident but not arrogant. He noticed the way her eyes darted back toward him, as if double-checking whether she had heard him right. It wasn't the kind of outright rudeness that could be easily pointed out. It was the quieter, invisible kind of doubt that hung in the air, invisible to those who had never lived it. When the sales executive finally arrived, a tall man in a sharp gray suit, his handshake was firm, but his smile was thin. His words were polite, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of skepticism. "Mr. Carter, is it? You're here to see the Falcon series?" he asked, his tone laced with a curiosity that didn't feel entirely professional. "Yes," John replied calmly. "I've reviewed the specs, and I'd like to go over options for long-range travel and cargo capacity." He spoke with the confidence of someone who had done his homework, who understood the business side of aviation, and who was ready to make an informed decision. But instead of nodding in approval or diving into details, the salesman tilted his head slightly, as if studying John the way someone studies a puzzle piece that doesn't seem to fit. "Of course," he said slowly, "but these are very high-value aircraft. Perhaps I could first show you some of our pre-owned models. They're more accessible to new buyers." The words hit John like a quiet slap. Accessible. New buyers. He hadn't even begun the discussion, yet already assumptions were being made about his ability, his worthiness, his place in that showroom. John kept his composure, offering only a polite smile. "I appreciate that," he said evenly, "but I'm here to discuss new models. I have the financing ready." The salesman hesitated, then nodded. Of course, he murmured. But his eyes carried the same disbelief as they walked through the hangar toward the jets. John noticed the difference in the salesman's demeanor compared to how he greeted another client just moments earlier. For the man in the expensive watch and tailored navy suit, there had been warm laughter, a clap on the back, a wide smile of familiarity. For John, there was restraint, distance, and a shadow of judgment. John had faced bias before in banks, in boardrooms, even at local community meetings where people questioned how a black farmer could rise so high. But here, in the world of aviation, where wealth and professionalism should be the only measure, he had hoped for something different. Yet, as he walked beside the salesman, he realized this was going to be another battlefield. At one point, the salesman asked almost casually, "And what exactly do you do, Mr. Carter?" His voice was polite, but the undertone was unmistakable. "How could someone like you afford this?" "I'm a farmer," John replied, meeting his gaze without flinching. The salesman chuckled lightly, as though thinking John was joking. "A farmer," he repeated. "Yes," John said firmly. "A farmer. I own and manage one of the largest independent farms in the region. We supply 2 national chains, and we're expanding into international markets. That's why I need an aircraft." The chuckle faded, replaced by a look of awkwardness, but not apology. The salesman nodded slowly, still with the same hint of disbelief. For John, this was the first true glimpse of bias. Not shouted words, not open insults, but the quieter disbelief that clung to every interaction. It was the way they looked at him, the way they spoke to him, the way they measured him not by his achievements, but by their own assumptions. Inside, John felt a sting of anger, but he pressed it down. He had learned long ago that anger only gave them power. Instead, he reminded himself why he was there, not for their approval, but for his future. He would not let their bias ruin the moment he had worked so hard to reach, as the salesman showed him the features of one of the jets. John listened carefully, asked smart questions, and demonstrated his knowledge. Yet, with each answer he gave, he could see the salesman's surprise growing, as though John's competence was unexpected, even unwelcome. The bias was subtle, but it was undeniable. It was in the raised eyebrows, the careful tones, the way the salesman explained simple things, as though John wouldn't understand. It was the same old story, playing out in a new setting. A successful black man forced to prove, over and over again, that he deserved to stand where he stood by the end of the tour. John had already seen enough to know that this purchase would not be just about money, it would be about dignity. He was ready to buy a jet, but he was also prepared to fight against every ounce of prejudice that tried to stand in his way. For now, he kept his head high, his voice steady, and his spirit unshaken. The first glimpse of bias had appeared, but John Carter was no stranger to storms. What they did not know was that every biased look, every doubtful word, every condescending tone only sharpened his resolve. He was not just here to buy a jet. He was here to break barriers that others thought could never be broken. And so, the seed of confrontation had been planted. A seed that would soon grow into a moment of humiliation, so sharp it would shake the room but also awaken a fire in John that could not be silenced. Asterisk. The first signs of bias had been subtle: the raised eyebrows, the chuckles, the disbelief in the salesman's voice. But as the meeting continued, that quiet skepticism began to harden into something sharper. Something John Carter had felt before in other rooms, but had hoped not to feel here. Outright humiliation. It started small. As John and the salesman sat down in a polished office with glass walls overlooking the hangar, the salesman leaned back in his chair, flipping through brochures as though he wasn't fully convinced the meeting was worth his time. "Mr. Carter," he began slowly, "these jets cost upwards of $25 million. They're not exactly the kind of purchase people make lightly. Are you sure this is what you're looking for?" John kept his expression calm. "I wouldn't be here if I wasn't sure," he replied evenly. His voice carried no anger, only the quiet authority of a man who knew his own mind. But the salesman wasn't finished. He smirked slightly, tapping his pen against the brochure. "And do you have financing in place? And most of our clients provide proof of funds before we go too deep into discussions." The words hung heavy in the air. John had noticed that the man who toured the hangar before him, a white businessman in a luxury car, had not been asked such a question. At least, not so bluntly. The assumption was clear. That man belonged here, while John had to prove he did. "Yes," John said firmly, sliding a neatly prepared folder across the table. Inside were financial statements, letters from his bank, and documentation that left no room for doubt. He had come prepared, knowing this might happen. The salesman opened the folder, glanced at the papers, and for a brief moment, his smile faltered. The numbers were undeniable. John Carter could afford this jet, but instead of acknowledging it, the salesman chuckled softly and muttered, "Well, you don't see that every day. A farmer with a balance sheet like this." There it was. Humiliation, delivered not as a direct insult, but as a backhanded remark meant to sting. John's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. He had learned long ago that responding to every insult gave it power. Still, the humiliation didn't stop there. When another executive entered the room, a woman with a sharp suit and clipboard. Salesman gestured toward John and introduced him with an air of disbelief. "This is Mr. Carter. He's a farmer." Looking into one of the falcons. The woman raised her eyebrows, forcing a polite smile. "A farmer? That's impressive," she said, though her tone suggested surprise rather than genuine respect. John extended his hand to her, his smile steady, his handshake firm. "Yes, farming is business, just like aviation. The numbers don't lie." But the looks exchanged between the two executives told him everything. They weren't just surprised, they were amused. To them, the idea of a black farmer buying a private jet was something almost laughable, something that didn't fit into their narrow image of who could sit in those chairs. The meeting dragged on, each question wrapped in doubt. "Are you sure you want new? Maybe pre-owned is better. Do you understand the maintenance costs? They can be significant. Would leasing be more appropriate?" Each word carried the same message. "You don't belong here. You don't deserve this." And then came the sharpest cut, as John rose to step back into the hangar. Another salesman passing by looked him up and down, then muttered under his breath, but loud enough for John to hear, "Strange times when anyone can just walk in and pretend to buy a jet." The words landed like a heavy blow. John froze for a split second, his hands tightening at his sides. Pretend to buy a jet. He had worked his entire life to reach this point, built a fortune from the soil beneath his feet, and here he was, treated like a fraud, a trespasser in a world he had every right to stand in. Humiliation surged through him, not because he doubted himself, but because of the sheer injustice of it. He had expected professionalism, respect, maybe even admiration. Instead, he was being made to feel small, as though his achievements didn't matter. As though the color of his skin and the dirt under his fingernails defined him more than the millions in his bank account. For a moment, John considered walking out. His pride screamed at him to leave, to remind them that his money could buy a jet anywhere else. But then another thought entered his mind. Why should he walk away? Why should he allow their prejudice to steal the moment he had earned? So instead of leaving, John stood taller. He turned to the salesman who had made the remark, his voice steady but laced with steel. "Pretending is something I've never had time for. Everything I've built with my own 2 hands. If you can't recognize a serious client when you see one, that says more about you than it does about me." The room fell silent for a moment. The executives shifted uncomfortably, the arrogance in their faces briefly replaced by embarrassment. But John knew the damage was done. The humiliation lingered in the air like smoke, staining what should have been one of the proudest days of his life. As he left the office later, his heart was heavy. The dream of buying a jet hadn't disappeared, but the experience had been tainted. Instead of celebrating his success, he had been forced to defend it. Instead of being treated as a client, he had been treated as an intruder, walking back toward the parking lot. John thought about how many times he had lived this story in different forms, in banks, in meetings, in public spaces where people assumed he didn't belong. And now, even here, in the world of luxury aviation, the same story repeated. Humiliation had tried to break him before, and it was trying again now. But John Carter was not a man who broke easily. He knew this moment, painful as it was, would not be the end of his story. If anything, it would become fuel for his determination, fuel for his resilience, and fuel for his voice. Because humiliation, he realized, was not the end. It was the beginning of something bigger. And though he walked away from the hangar that day with anger in his chest, he also carried a fire in his heart, a fire that would soon ignite conversations. Far beyond that showroom asterisk. When John Carter drove away from the hangar that day, the city lights blurred outside his window. The engine hummed, but his mind was louder, replaying every detail of what had just happened. The smirk on the salesman's face, the disbelief in their eyes, the cruel whisper pretending to buy a jet. Each moment replayed like a cut, sharp and fresh, carving into his pride. At first, he tried to shake it off. He told himself it was just business, that not everyone in sales was respectful, that people doubted clients all the time. But deep inside, he knew this was different. He had felt doubt before. He had been questioned about his finances, his decisions, even his ambitions. But what happened inside that hangar was not ordinary doubt, was racism wearing the mask of professionalism. It was the kind of racism that never shouted. It never raised its voice. It never used words that could be written down and proven. Instead, it whispered in tones, in looks, in smirks. It lived in assumptions that a black farmer could not possibly be rich enough, smart enough, or serious enough to belong in a world of jets. And that, John realized, was its true cruelty. Because this kind of racism did not just insult it, humiliate it. It stripped away dignity in ways that were invisible to outsiders, but deeply felt by the one who endured it. And as John drove through the night, he felt that sting in every corner of his soul. He thought about his father, who had once told him, "Son, no matter how high you climb, some people will only ever see you as the boy from the fields." At the time, John had thought those words were a warning. Now, he realized they were prophecy. No matter how much land he owned, no matter how many millions he earned, no matter what contracts he signed, there were still places where people would refuse to see him as anything but less. The pain of that realization settled heavy in his chest. It wasn't just about him. It was about every black man and woman who had worked hard, risen high, and still been met with the same old story. You don't belong here. The humiliation from that day wasn't just professional, it was personal. For John, the jet had represented a dream born from struggle, a reward for years of sweat and sacrifice. But instead of joy, the experience had turned into a reminder that racism didn't vanish when success arrived. It waited at the door of every new achievement, ready to remind him that no matter how high he rose, prejudice would try to pull him back down. He thought about the look on the receptionist's face when he walked in, the disbelief in the salesman's chuckle, the amused tone of the woman who joined the meeting. Each look, each word, had been soaked in something deeper than doubt. It was as if his presence itself was an offense, as if his dream was an insult to the unspoken rules of their world. And that hurt more than anything. Not because he doubted himself. John knew what he had achieved, knew the numbers in his accounts, knew the empire he had built from soil and sweat. But because, once again, his humanity had been reduced to skin color. His worth had been measured not by his achievements, but by prejudice. The pain sat heavy on him as he pulled into his driveway that night. His farm spread out under the stars. The same land that had carried him through storms and droughts. The same land that had lifted him from nothing to abundance. He stepped out of his truck, inhaled the familiar scent of earth, and for a moment he felt grounded. But even the land could not erase the echo of those words pretending to buy a jet. He sat on the porch for a long time, staring out into the fields. Memories washed over him, his father's hands, rough from labor. his mother's voice singing while she carried baskets of vegetables, his own younger self dreaming of a future no one believed possible. And now, after everything, he wondered, had the dream been too bold? Had he stepped into a world that wasn't meant for him? But almost as soon as the thought entered, John pushed it away. That was the trap of racism. Its power was not just in the insult, but in the way it tried to plant doubt inside the heart of the one who endured it. Its aim was to make him question himself, to make him shrink, to make him stop reaching for more. John refused to give it that power. Still, the pain lingered. Racism, he realized, wasn't just an external enemy. It was something that crawled inside, pressing down on the spirit, leaving scars that never fully healed. He could still hear the salesman's laugh, still see the surprise in their eyes when they realized his finances were real. It wasn't just business. It was a wound that cut into his dignity. What made it worse was knowing that this was not new. It was the same story replayed in different rooms, in different forms. He thought about the time a bank officer refused him a loan despite his strong credit. He remembered the supplier who told him, "You people usually don't last long in this business." He remembered walking into meetings where his ideas were dismissed until someone else repeated them. It was the same pain. Dressed in different clothes, John closed his eyes, breathing deeply. He had endured pain before: physical pain from long hours in the fields, financial pain from seasons of loss, emotional pain from setbacks and struggles. But the pain of racism was different. It was invisible, hard to explain, often denied by those who caused it. And yet, it was heavy enough to crush even the strongest spirit you let it. John decided he would not let it. He stood up from the porch, his body still tense, but his resolve firm. The humiliation had been real, the pain undeniable, but it would not define him. He was not just a victim of racism. He was a man who had survived it, endured it, and risen above it, time and again. This pain would not be the end of his story, would be the fire that pushed him further. As he looked out over his fields under the night sky, John whispered softly to himself, "They try to humiliate me, but they don't know who I am. They don't know how far I've come, and they will never decide how far I go." The pain of racism was deep, but so was his strength. And though the wound still bled in his heart, John knew it would heal not into weakness, but into armor. Armor that would protect him in the battles yet to come. For days after the humiliation at the jet dealership, John Carter carried the weight of the experience like a stone in his chest. He went about his work on the farm, as usual, walking the fields at sunrise, checking on machinery, meeting with buyers, but inside, something had shifted. The quiet sting of prejudice had followed him home, followed him into his sleep, and followed him back into the soil he loved. Normally, John dealt with racism in silence. He had learned long ago that the world was rarely sympathetic to such complaints. Too often, people brushed it off. Maybe it wasn't about race, they would say, or you're being too sensitive. So, like many before him, John carried those wounds quietly, patching them with hard work and burying them beneath success. But this time, it felt different. This time, he realized, silence would mean surrender. The incident at the dealership was not just an insult to him. It was an insult to every black entrepreneur who had dared to step outside the box society tried to keep them in. If he stayed quiet, the story would end in that glass office, forgotten by everyone but him. But if he spoke, maybe the story could live beyond his pain. Maybe it could open eyes, stir conversations, and force people to see the truth that racism was alive even in the most polished rooms, even in the world of luxury, even in places money should have erased barriers. The decision weighed heavily. On him, speaking up meant exposure. It meant opening himself to criticism, doubt, and backlash. People would question his motives, twist his words, and accuse him of exaggeration. He would have to relive the humiliation again and again. But when John thought about his children, his daughter, who dreamed of becoming a doctor, his son, who talked about taking over the farm, he knew he couldn't stay quiet. He wanted them to grow up in a world where they didn't have to fight the same invisible battles. So, one evening, sitting at his kitchen table with only the hum of the refrigerator filling the silence, John began to write. At first, the words came slowly, heavy with emotion. He wrote about how excited he had been to finally take the step toward buying a jet. He wrote about the looks, the smirks, the questions meant to belittle. He wrote about the cruel remark that branded him a pretender in a place he had every right to be. And then, he wrote about the deeper pain, the way racism doesn't just block opportunities, but steals dignity, stripping moments of joy and turning them into memories of shame. He didn't write as a businessman or a farmer. He wrote as a man, raw and unfiltered, putting his truth on paper. When he was finished, he read it aloud to his wife. Her eyes filled with tears as she listened, not because the story surprised her, she had witnessed similar moments in his journey, but because of the courage it took to share it. People need to hear this, she said firmly. Not just for you, but for all of us. Encouraged by her words, John shared his story publicly. He posted it online, attaching it to a photo of his pharma, reminder that success had not shielded him from prejudice. He didn't expect much. Perhaps a few friends would read it, maybe his local community would talk about it. But within hours, his post began to spread. At first, it was shared by fellow farmers, men and women who had known their own struggles with discrimination. Then it spread further, picked up by business networks, activists, and everyday people who felt his pain in their own lives. Comments poured in, thousands of them, from people across the country and even around the world. Some wrote about their own experiences of being doubted, humiliated, or disrespected because of their race. Others expressed outrage, demanding accountability from the dealership for the first time. John realized his humiliation had become more than just his own story. It had become a mirror, reflecting a truth many had felt, but few had spoken. His pain had turned into a collective voice. Of course, not everyone supported him. Some dismissed his story, accusing him of exaggeration or playing the race card. Others argued that he should have ignored it. That money was enough to silence any insult. But John had expected this. Racism was not just in the cruel words, it was in the denial of its existence. Okay, and he refused to let that denial silence him. As the story spread, local reporters reached out. Kay wanted to interview him, to hear more about his journey as a black farmer who had risen against the odds, only to face humiliation at the doorstep of his dream. At first, John hesitated. He wasn't a man who sought the spotlight. But then he thought about all the people who had written to him, thanking him for speaking out, telling him they felt less alone because of his words. And he realized this wasn't about him anymore. It was about giving voice to everyone who had been silenced, so he spoke. He told his story on camera, his voice steady, his eyes unwavering. He didn't raise his voice or exaggerate. He simply told the truth, that success had not protected him from racism, and that dignity was something no one should have to beg for. His interviews went viral. News outlets picked up his story. Conversations erupted online and offline about racism in elite industries, about the barriers that still existed even for those who had made it. People who had never thought about discrimination in aviation began to ask questions. Why should a black man with money still be treated as though he didn't belong? Why did wealth not erase prejudice? John watched all of this unfold with mixed emotions. Part of him still carried the pain of the original humiliation. The memory still stung. But another part of him felt something else, something powerful. For the first time, his pain had purpose. What had been meant to belittle him had instead amplified him. What had been meant to shame him had instead given him a platform. His humiliation had become his turning point, transforming from a wound into a weapon against silence, against ignorance, against the quiet cruelty of racism. And deep inside, John knew this was only the beginning. He had not chosen this battle, but now that it had come to him, he would fight it not just for himself, but for every farmer, every dreamer, every black man or woman told they didn't belong as he stood once more in his fields one evening. Watching the sun dip below the horizon, John whispered to himself, "They tried to break me. Instead, they built me." The turning point had come, and there would be no going back. The storm of humiliation, a sting of racism, and the fire of determination had all led John Carter to a place he never imagined he would stand. A man whose story was no longer just his own, but a symbol of something much larger. What began as a private dream to buy a jet had transformed into a public moment that touched thousands of lives. And though the pain still lingered inside him, what rose above it was something greater, a legacy of strength. In the weeks after his story spread, John noticed a change, not only in how others saw him, but in how he saw himself. For years, he had carried the weight of discrimination in silence. He had endured it with clenched teeth and quiet resolve, burying his wounds beneath his success. But now, those wounds had been exposed to the light, and instead of shame, they carried power. His voice had reached beyond the farm, beyond his community, beyond the hangar where the insult was born. It had reached people who needed to hear it. Letters began arriving at his farm, handwritten notes from strangers who felt inspired by his courage. Some came from young farmers just starting out, telling him that his story gave them hope. Others came from professionals in cities far away, people who had faced their own forms of prejudice in boardrooms and offices, thanking him for speaking out. One letter from a single mother in another state simply read, "You don't know me, but your story made me feel less invisible. Thank you." These messages touched John more deeply than he expected. They reminded him that his struggle was not just his own, it was shared by countless others. And in that realization, he found healing. The humiliation no longer felt like a scar. It felt like a badge of survival, proof that he had endured what many could not, and turned it into something unbreakable. But John's legacy was not built only on words. He understood that true strength came from action. If racism could humiliate him in one of the most elite industries, then he would use his platform to open doors for others. He began speaking at schools, telling children about his journey from the fields to becoming a successful businessman. He wanted them to see that dreams, even those that seemed impossible, were worth chasing. He also launched a foundation for minority farmers, offering mentorship, financial literacy training, and resources that he wished he had when he was starting out. "The land doesn't care what color you are," he told them, "but the world will, and you have to be stronger than the world's prejudice." The foundation grew quickly, supported by donors who had been moved by his story. Within a year, it was helping dozens of young farmers across the country, giving them the tools to succeed in an industry that often shut its doors to people of color. John realized that this, more than the jet, more than the money, was his true legacy, lifting others, turning his pain into their strength. Yet, through all the recognition and all the new responsibilities, John never forgot the soil that had made him. Each morning, he still walked his fields, still touched the earth with his hands, still inhaled the scent of crops swaying under the wind. Farming was not just his livelihood, was his anchor, and he wanted the world to see that greatness could come from the ground up, literally. The humiliation at the dealership had once threatened to break him, but now, looking back, John saw it differently. It had been the test that turned him into more than just a successful man. It had turned him into a leader. Leaders are not made. In moments of comfort, they are forged in moments of pain, when the easy choice is to walk away. But the stronger choice is to stand and speak. John chose the stronger path, and it gave him a strength that could not be measured by money, land, or even the wings of a jet. It was a strength that lived in his spirit, in the lives he touched, and in the generations who would remember his story long after he was gone. His children, too, began to see him differently. They had always admired their father's hard work, but now they admired his courage. They saw the way he faced prejudice head-on, the way he refused to bow his head, the way he turned insults into inspiration. For them, his legacy was personal. It was the foundation on which they would build their own dreams. Armed with the knowledge that dignity must never be surrendered, no matter the cost. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the fields in shades of gold, John stood on his porch with his son beside him. The boy asked softly, "Daddy, do you still want to buy a jet?" John smiled, the lines on his face deepening with wisdom. "Yes, son," he said. "One day, I will. But whether I fly in a jet or walk in these fields, remember this sits. Not the plane that makes the man. It's the fight in him. It's the strength to keep going when others tell you to stop. That's what takes you higher than any jet ever could." The boy nodded, his eyes wide with understanding. And in that moment, John knew that his dream had already taken flight, not in steel wings, but in the hearts of those who would carry his story forward. Because a legacy of strength is not about wealth, it is not about property or status or even the symbols of success. It is about resilience. It is about turning humiliation into honor, pain into power, and silence into a voice that refuses to be ignored. John Carter's name might never appear in history books, but in the lives of those he inspired, he had already written a legacy. A legacy that said, "You can start with nothing, endure everything, and still rise with dignity." And that legacy, stronger than any storm, would live long after John's footsteps had left the fields he loved.